Okay, Carl, thank you very much for being with us tonight. I'm turning the program over to you now.
Lisa, thanks so much. I have a little screen here that I'm trying to get rid of. I don't know if it's going to go away or not. This meeting is being recorded. By staying in this meeting, your consent. Okay, I said got it. Oh, there it goes. It went away. So, hi. This is an odd thing for me to be doing, but I'm happy to do it for the library and the Friends. I'm honored to be on here talking about the library. I'm a big library fan. I think libraries have everything to do with democracy. And so I am Karl Meyer. I am a member of the Society of Environmental Journalists. As some of you folks I know here are, I have been writing about the Connecticut River, for a quarter century or so. I have both worked at the Connecticut River Watershed Council and also worked at the Northfield Mountain Recreation Center for like 6 years, which is sort of almost dead center about what most of what I talk about, will be talking about, which is the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Station, which is just about 1,000 feet above the visitor center. So the other piece I wanted to note, just make note of as far as being a journalist is I just encourage people to subscribe to local media, pay for the journalism you're getting. If we want to have a democratic society, we really do need that. And I say this to you as a journalist, even though most of the writing that you see that I write ends up on the op-ed pages. So it is work that I do for free, essentially. And I consider my work for the Connecticut River sort of a full-time job, to be honest with you. So I'm trying to figure out what I might be able to talk to folks about, which will sort of clarify and sort of leave you with something, a better understanding of how the river operates, why we are where we are in the midst of what's an ongoing Federal Energy Regulatory Commission relicensing process, which began, we're into our 10th year. It began in the year 2012, but it will basically ultimately deliver the conditions that will exist in Massachusetts in the Connecticut River ecosystem for 20, 30, 40 years. And the beginning premise here and the takeaways I want you to know about is, first of all, I'm hoping you walk away understanding how Northfield Mountain Pump Storage works. Because I consider it the most devastating and deadly appliance ever installed on the Connecticut River in the industrial age. I want you to know what it is, what it does, and what are the future plans for it. And then I'm going to also, I want people to walk away sort of understanding Connecticut River Atlantic salmon, which were never endangered on the Connecticut River throughout the 50 years that we had this giant sort of hatchery program on the river. The Connecticut River salmon were gone by 1809, and somehow we turned the last 50 years, actually 43 because it's gone, into a restore an extinct strain of salmon, which were gone on the Connecticut River, 150 years. Why it never worked and how it is affecting where we are today. Because basically, in this relicensing process, we are trying to recover the water and the fish that were owed to us like 50 years ago in the original license. So that's another piece that I want you to go home with. And then I want you to know who the agencies involved are, who's bargaining on supposedly the public's behalf. And I want to leave you with a few names. But I come at this premise with the fact that we really don't have a living river in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There was an old saying that the Connecticut River was once America's best landscape sewer. And that was from the late 60s. And then we ended up with the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. And many of the country's rivers got cleaned up to a point where they were, quote, fishable, swimmable. That was that sort of the baseline. It wasn't a very high bar. And the Connecticut River actually was semi-restored by 1855, all the way up to Turner's Falls, Massachusetts, because they had built a fish lift at Holyoke. So you didn't really have far to go. Turner's Falls were where the fish on the Connecticut River had been blocked since 1798, but they were restored. There were already fish moving up from Holyoke up to mile 122, which is the Turner's Falls Dam, by 1955. But the federal agencies, about 15 years later, ended up bargaining for the wrong fish passage. And so now, 50 years after the building of the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Station, which feeds off the Connecticut River behind Turner's Falls Dam, we are bargaining for fish passage that was sort of owed to us if the mistakes had been made 50 years ago, 49 years ago. The Connecticut River, I believe, is, to me, it's a kind of a sacred place. It's a living thing. It is broken in Massachusetts. I recently wrote on my blog, which is Karl Meyer Writing Blog, you can find it, that in Massachusetts, since 1972, when the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Station came online, we are still America's best landscape sewer. And so I guess what I should start with right now is, what exactly is Northfield Mountain? What is pump storage? And then we'll move on from there. So Northfield Mountain was conceived in the mid-1960s, along with the Vermont Yankee nuclear plant. And there was this idea that, okay, Vermont Yankee is going to be this too cheap to meter major appliance upstream. And, we no longer have to worry about how much electricity we consume. So they were building this giant nuclear plant, a 600 megawatt nuclear plant. And this was being built by Western Mass Electric and Northeast Utilities. And someone came up with the great idea, why don't we hack the top off of Northfield Mountain, create a 4 billion gallon reservoir about 900 or 1,000 feet above the Connecticut River. We'll raise the dam at Turner's Falls, and we will have this big basin of water that we can suck up to the top of the mountain. And then we'll let it down, during peak prices and peak demand times, or a couple hours in the morning, a couple of hours in the afternoon. It was going to run on nuclear power because you would pump the water up at night. So it's basically an electric toilet. I mean, that's what I want people to understand. And the toilet tank is virtually the Connecticut River. They call it their lower reservoir, but it's basically a giant electric toilet that originally was going to run off the night megawatts, the cheap or no cost megawatts, pump the river backwards, and it started doing that in 1972. So what's it like when a river gets pumped backwards, 20 miles of river? Well, they can pump at the rate of 15,000 cubic feet per second. If you want to talk about, or you want to envision what 15,000 cubic feet per second is, you got four turbines in the middle of the mountain, reversed, and they are suctioning up the river at the rate of, basically, picture an 8-bedroom, 8-bathroom, big den, major dining room mansion. One of those every second, right? A 15,000-foot mansion, all the aquatic life in it for hours at a time. So you end up with what, 60 seconds. So you got 60 of those. And then in an hour, you got 3,600. Everything that goes up is virtually extinguished. And that is baby shad, eggs, larvae, dragonfly larvae, everything. This is the Connecticut River's biggest killer. And it exists today in the middle of the Silvio O. Conti Connecticut River National Fish and Wildlife Refuge. And it is today still America's best landscape sewer. I recently wrote a blog about the fact that the Watershed Council, now doing business as the Conservancy, they've had exactly 25 Saturdays of river cleanup and kind of congratulatory stuff. And meanwhile, every day for the last 18,000 days or so, this beast is using up massive amounts of energy and sucking everything that comes into its sphere, into that vortex, up to the top. And then they send it down for a few hours of peak price energy in the morning or afternoon. And it's dead. They're virtually. So where is the cleanup? I mean, the Connecticut River, I was recently on a train, went across the mouth of the Connecticut River, and living rivers, which the name of this program is Living Rivers Flow Downstream. The Connecticut River, if you look up the definition of a river, everything says a natural body of water flowing downstream. They mention gravity. And the Connecticut River, they always say, well, it flows into Long Island Sound. And I was down there in Long Island, well, not in Massachusetts, not behind the Turner's Falls Dam. The Connecticut River in Massachusetts flows backwards and up into this grim electric sewer at Northfield Mountain for up to 3 miles at times. About a third of the year, the river's what they call the natural routed flow. That means all the median natural routed flow, I think yearly is somewhere around 10,000 cubic feet per second. So that would be all the water that's entering it from, say, the Millers River, the Eschweiler, some other little streams. But then that drops down into the 4,000s at times, right? So when there's just that much water entering the river and you turn on your turbines at 15,000 cubic feet per second, studies have shown that that river is virtually running backwards for 3 miles plus. We don't even know. The study was only for 5 kilometers, and that's over 3 miles. And I read in the paper sometimes how, the town of Montague, the banks are failing along Millers Falls Road. And I'm thinking, well, why is the town paying for this when you have this virtual behemoth that is doing this suck and flow stuff, and you have freeze and thaw during the winter, and nobody sort of ever looks at Northfield Mountain. It just kind of amazes me. And then, there are downstream problems on Montague City Road where they've been diverting water away from their power canal, and the diversion seems to head towards Montague City Road. So this thing creates no end of havoc on the Connecticut River. I don't consider the Connecticut a living river in Massachusetts in any way, shape, or form. And I think we owe it to coming generations to stop using such a grim machine. You get one chance in a century to restore an ecosystem, one chance. There was one before Northfield Mountain was built. The federal agencies that are still in charge, basically U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries, Mass Division, their names were a little different in 1972 and 1965. And of course, the Watershed Council, who's supposed to be the watchdog, is around since 1952. And I can tell you that if you went into the library at Northfield Mountain, you would find there's a little cardboard sort of advertising piece from OMECO, Northeast Utilities, and it was about the coming of how we're going to build this pump storage station. And one of the scenarios, there were like 3 scenarios presented, and one of them was, well, there's some issues about what is going to happen during fish migration season when we turn these pumps on. And so one of the scenarios was to not use it during fish migration season. Was that ever picked up? No. Were there studies done before this thing came online? There were not. Who is Northfield Mountain owned by now? There's a corporation. It's called Public Sector Pension Investments, right? The river has basically been taken over for its 20 miles by a venture capital firm, a huge venture capital firm, a $20 billion venture capital firm whose profits reported in June went up 18%. So that is the umbrella owners. And then you have First Light. They bought up the First Light name. PSP arrived in 2016. In 2018, First Light turned around and re-registered the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Station and their Turner's Falls and Cabot assets out of New England, out of Massachusetts, out of harm's way for taxation purposes with the state of Delaware. If you want to talk about the new Pandora's box and sort of evading taxes, well, here we have it. It was in Delaware. Delaware is the South Dakota. It's offshoring. They did not come here as our friends. And now we are having to sit down and ask them for water, which is the public's water. And these are the public's fish. And, just to give you some idea of the treachery of Northfield Mountain, and I have written this and I stand by it. This is a plant that literally kills hundreds of millions of fish and aquatic creatures every year for the last 49 years. One of the big pieces that has been in the Connecticut River for the last 50 years about restoration was they were supposed to restore American shad all the way up into Vermont and New Hampshire, all the way to Bellows Falls. Well, they basically screwed up the fish passage, right? But a very small percent of American shad, 7 to 9%, actually are able to squeeze through the miserable fish passage design that they built. But there were studies during this relicensing, and I'm a stakeholder in this relicensing. I've actually been doing that since 2012. It's another sort of volunteer piece I do. I have actually intervened in the process because they were essentially breaking environmental laws. Of course, I was brushed aside by FERC. But a study done, I think, in 2016 between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Mass Division of Fisheries and Wildlife Service, estimating just for one species alone, American shad, coming downstream from Vermont and New Hampshire, the estimation were, and as I said, everything that gets sucked in comes out dead, 2 million juvenile shad. These are baby shad that are produced in Vermont and New Hampshire would be just basically obliterated. 10 million fish, 10 million eggs and larvae, just gone, okay? These are fish that are heading downstream to the ocean that are supposed to come back. And the original plan for the fisheries restoration, which was begun in 1967, was that we were going to have 850,000 American shad passing Turner's Falls every year. We obviously never got there. But if we have another 50 years of this killer plant, I don't see how you can call this a restored or a living river. I've described Northfield Mountain as a heart attack followed by a stroke. It literally stops the river dead in its tracks. 2/3 of the time that Northfield Mountain is pumping water uphill, the river is going to be pulled backwards to some length. But I said, as I mentioned, in certain periods of the year, that is actually 3 miles plus. We do not know the full extent of it, but that's just one species, right? There are 26, I believe, different species. Some of them migratory, some of them resident fish. Some have been introduced, but they're all our resident fish now. Everything that goes in there during the spawning season, everything that goes up Northfield Mountain, gone. And no attempt through these last 49 years. When people knew about this, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries, no attempt ever to close the mouth of this. I consider it an illegal plant. I believe, and I talked about this, I was going to give a 50-year history. If you go back 50 years, it was 1971. 1971 was probably the last year that the whole Connecticut River had any sort of the basic characteristics of a living river in Massachusetts. It was still flowing downstream. The next year, it started flowing backwards. At this point, I'm going to sort of take a sip of water and step back. I hope I'm being clear as I talk to you. And you can go to my blog to get information on this. But I don't think this plant deserves a new license. It does not meet conditions set out in 1872. There was a stare decisis, landmark environmental legislation on the Connecticut River at Holyoke Dam. It was Holyoke Company versus Lyman. And at that point, almost exactly 150 years ago, on US rivers, migratory fish were entitled to upstream and downstream safe passage. So 50 years ago, you still had a river coming downstream in 1971, right? In 1972, you had Northfield virtually forcing the river to eat its young. And I think it didn't meet the Supreme Court landmark decision in 1972 as soon as it began operating. Those are federal trust fish. They belong to the public. In other states, there's literally money involved there. There are tables that say this is how much a single pickerel is worth. This is how much a shad. This is how much a juvenile shad. Never paid for a thing. And I guess the other piece that I should sort of move into is, first of all, I promised I was going to take a sip of water, is the absolute waste that Northfield Mountain is. Northfield Mountain is literally an electric appliance, right? It runs off the power grid. I checked the power grid this morning. Northfield Mountain started off running on nuclear power. Vermont Yankee closed in 2014, so there was no more local nuclear power. So it was just running off the energy of the power grid. Today's power grid, this was, I don't know what time this morning. Northfield Mountain is a gas plant today, and most days, 50, 75, 80, 85%. Today, it was 70% natural gas that was running that plant. I think another 12% was nuclear imported from either the coast in New Hampshire or Connecticut. There was another around 10% hydropower, which is not Northfield Mountain. Northfield Mountain will never be clean. It will never be renewable. The hydropower that we get here in Massachusetts, most of it comes down from the Canadian Maritimes. Grand River Yard, these big projects that have disrupted ecosystems up there, and it gets sent down here. So that's another piece of how you run a river backward and keep everything and kill everything that goes up there. So that is what we are doing, right? So Northfield has never produced a single watt of its own virgin electricity. It is concerned in PSP investments and First Light, the money goes to Delaware for laundering, and it gets sent back up to Canada. But it has never produced a single watt of virgin power. It basically is an energy storage and relay plant, and that power is not necessarily being used locally. It goes to ISO New England. They auction it off 3 years ahead of time. And ISO New England can send it anywhere they want to. But mostly, I think it goes back to the bigger coastal cities. But they can send it down to markets in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland market, or the NISO, New York system operator. It is the darling of ISO New England and FERC, two institutions that do not give a hair about ecosystems or climate. You know, as we pull this river backwards, you know, using natural gas, it's an obscenity in my view. So that is where we are day to day. That is what your river is being used for. And right now, negotiations are taking place secretly. I have been a stakeholder in this relicensing for now 9+ years, and before that there were meetings, but I refused to sign the secret agreement with First Light, the non-disclosure agreement that they had, all the federal agencies and the towns. This is all about money. This is all about money, and if you go to my blog or you've read any of my writing, people always sort of say, well, I really like what you said, but I didn't understand it, which I completely honor that. When I write in the paper, I have to talk to several audiences. Some of them are the federal agencies and the fisheries people, and the other ones are the power people. But if you go to my blog, I mean, basically, there's probably 12 years of stuff there, and basically what I write about is the river's broken. The river is broken. No one's doing anything about it. The river is broken. The river is broken. They're breaking the law. We don't have a watchdog on the Connecticut River. And I say that as someone who twice worked for the Connecticut River Watershed Council. I think if you're a 69-year-old organization claiming to be protective of 4 states in the middle of a national fish and wildlife refuge, and you don't have a single lawyer on staff, and you just recently changed your name to the Conservancy, and you didn't change your mission statement to say that we investigate and we prosecute. That is how 50 years and more of eating a river happens, right in your backyard, right where you are located. That is why federal agencies have sort of stood around and just ignored the fact that they made the wrong decision almost 50 years ago that ruined a river restoration that should have happened beginning, the idea of it was started in 1967, and we should have had fish passage just like what was working at Holyoke in 1955 at Turner's Falls. So let me segue a little bit. I'm trying to keep an eye on watch here. So I'm going to segue a bit to what happened in the last 50 years. Why are we where we are now? Why are we bargaining for things that we've been entitled to for a long time? And we may be looking at just sort of scrubbing the idea of a living ecosystem for coming generations. And, I find rivers are the cooling arteries of the planet. You do not squander your only chance in a half century to restore an ecosystem. But I'm afraid that so little has been accepted as duty by the federal agencies and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that PSP Investments is going to overpower the table with their money. They've been giving out money to little nonprofits and stuff sort of quietly. It's worth noting here that they're operating a plant that was built by Western Mass Electric Company, Northeast Utilities. I worked at the visitor center, as I mentioned, but Northeast Utilities is now doing business as Eversource. And you might have noticed that Eversource is in the news because they owe $44 million in taxes to the city of Springfield. You might have, if you're paying attention, and I do, and I don't blame people if they don't, but Eversource now owns Columbia Gas. Remember the Columbia Gas explosion? They are now a gas company. And if you look under their name in Connecticut, I think they must have a law where they have to own up to every limited liability corporation that they own, but is out there under another name. I think I found 43 of them. And this is still the company that is wired massively into Northfield Mountain. And if you notice, if you wonder why there has never been any sort of pressure, to make the federal agencies or the river run right, the Connecticut, what is now the Connecticut River Conservancy, has had a long and very close financial and business relationship and board relationship with Northeast Utilities, WMECO, going back to before Northfield Mountain was built, came online. And if you're going to lay claim to being a watchdog, I shouldn't be telling you this 50 years later. And a watchdog makes the federal agencies in the state U.S. and the State Fish and Wildlife Service do their jobs when there is no fish passage. But they are attached and they have their hands in the pocket of Eversource. They have their hands in the pocket via grants, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. And they also, we had the Eversource to Sea cleanup. That's many thousands of dollars every year. That's a pretty close relationship. And they made videos this year with First Light about how wonderful it is to clean up the river one day a year and pick up trash. Deeply disappointing. Let me just say that. So I'm getting sort of falling back a little bit. So I'm going to spend a little time just telling us why, or trying to convey why we're here. Why we're in this terrible situation, bargaining for things 50 years later. In 1967, there was something called the New England Cooperative Fisheries Agreement. There was science and fish science based at UMass, but it was an agreement between basically what's today's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries, and the 4 New England states: Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire. We are going to restore the Connecticut River. And they had this big compact, and it was agreed on, and it had it had the weight of federal authorization. And the first species mentioned was the American shad, who were still in the river, who was still alive, who had been here for time immemorial. And the idea was that there would be 1 million shad per year when they improved fish passage at Holyoke, coming past Holyoke. But we already had in 1955, fish were already passing. So we had restored a good portion of Connecticut River, right? Basically up to where we are today, but there were going to be 850,000 of those. And then the second fish mentioned was Atlantic salmon, which was kind of odd because there were no Atlantic salmon in the Connecticut River. There hadn't been since, I use 1809, some people use 1815, some people use 1800. In part because they built the first dam across the Connecticut River at Turner's Falls, right? But that was not the whole story. It never was the whole story. But the truth of the matter is, you don't start a river restoration basing it on an extinct strain of salmon. There were none, right? And all of a sudden, salmon, 850,000 shad were going to pass Turner's Falls, and they were going to create a new fishery, right? They were going to mix genetics. They were going to get they were going to get salmon from Atlantic Canada and Maine rivers where salmon were still hanging on. And they created this massive hatchery program, which cost ultimately hundreds of millions of dollars to create this new fish for the Connecticut River. Funny thing, they decided, instead of just using the basic clunky fish elevator that had been useful and was, by the mid-70s, there were hundreds of thousands of fish being lifted at Holyoke Dam into the pool up to being blocked at Turner's Falls Dam. By 1975, 76, there were hundreds of thousands of fish. Instead of doing that, they got so excited about salmon, right? They were going to promise us 37,000 salmon a year with 9,000 fishable. It was this trophy fish. It was just this big thing. But the cornerstone of the agreement between the feds and the states was they had two things. They were going to create a sports fishery, right? So yeah, you can get excited about salmon. Nobody's ever seen one, but we're excited to do that. And 850,000 shad up to Bellows Falls, fantastic. So what did they end up doing? they looked at the Columbia River in Washington State and Oregon, where there was fish passage built on this giant river. And they had still living various strains of salmon and migratory trout. And they were screaming up these ice harbor fishways that they had built there on this giant river. And they decided, that's what we're going to do. We're going to base it on Pacific salmon. And so they went ahead, they built all these fat hatcheries, right? They were going to produce millions and millions of salmon fry every year and release them. They were going to come back up the river. This is to get 35,000 fish left. So you're not really feeding the public with 35,000 salmon, 9,000 which were catchable. But the other mandate in this thing was to create a source of seafood for the public. Now, 850,000 shad. If you've ever eaten shad, it's a pretty good fish. They catch it in Connecticut below Holyoke. We could have had a commercial fishery. This river could be feeding us now, but they built this three ladder system that basically left the Connecticut River half dry in most places. It turned every migratory fish, every shad, every blueback herring, every sea lamprey, every American eel that was trying to get upstream for spawning into the Turners Falls Power Canal. And maybe 1, 2, 3 in 100 ever got by. And they knew in 1980 that they had built the wrong thing, but they never owned it. Meanwhile, Northfield Mountain keeps pumping along. So the few fish that pass up there, their young are eaten on the way down. And there was never any attempt to sort of own this and say, we have to do something about it. Now, we've done the wrong thing. How do we close the killer mouth of Northfield Mountain? How do we get more water in the river? And they basically never owned it. And the public has been sort of in this, this sort of crazy idea that salmon were important to the Connecticut River. And at this point, I just want to mention a few things about, certain heroes that sort of came along that have influenced me on the river. One of them goes back a long ways, a gentleman named Terry Blunt. And if you don't know Terry Blunt, I wish you had met him. He's gone about 11 years now. He headed for a very brief time the Connecticut River Watershed Council. And then I think he found out that their board was sort of industrially made and not river centric. But he founded the Connecticut Valley Action Program. If you look at the landscape around here, the Holyoke Range, Mount Sugarloaf, some of the most wonderful places were preserved by Terry Blunt. And I did some work when I was in college with him, did an independent study. Alexandra Dawson and Terry joined together and did heroic work when in the mid 1980s, they wanted to do even more damage with Northfield Mountain. They were going to take the water from the Connecticut River and pipe it to the Quabbin Reservoir. And it was to become another source of Boston water. And they teamed up and said, you can't do this. And they actually, Alexandra Dawson, who was from Hadley, was a professor. I went to Antioch, New England. She was a professor of mine at that time. But Terry and her and some other people just got together and said, you can't do this. They created something called the Interbasin Transfer Act, where you could not take water from one river system and move it out into another system without first closing all the leakage and all the bad wells and all the local water sources, so that we would at least have a living ecosystem here. I would argue that today, our Connecticut River being used right now by PSP Investments, it's being sold to the highest bidder. It's not local. It's heading back to the coast. Their ultimate excuse for keeping this thing running for the next 40 years is, we're going to build wind turbines 200 miles away, and we're going to send the electricity generated by that wind when it's low cost or no cost at night all the way out here, so that PSP can make money on sort of no cost wind. pump our river backwards and kill the ecosystem, and then send that energy back out to the coast. Are there other options? There certainly are. There is something called compressed air storage, which can be built out in Everett or Somerset, where all the big tanks are out in Boston off of I-90, 93, 95. Our river should not be sold down the river again. But that's sort of where we are. And another hero, I just have to mention a few more people. The river would be far more ruined today if it hadn't been for a gentleman named Sam Lovejoy in 1975. He toppled a tower on the Montague Plains. They were going to build 2 more nuclear plants here. We would have virtually no ecosystem. I don't know. Sam was definitely anti-nuclear. I don't know how much he sort of understood how dependent on the life of a river nuclear plants were. But he was certainly a stand-up person. And then I have to mention the sort of sad heroism of a woman named Catherine Carlson, who basically in 1992 in the anthropology department of UMass published her thesis that basically encapsulated the role of Atlantic salmon on the Connecticut River in history and prehistory, and basically she pointed directly to the fact to why the salmon program wasn't working. You don't start a restoration program at the southernmost river that a cold water migratory fish has ever colonized, right? That's what they did here, right? You take a fish that's extinct and try to create one that's going to come up a river that's already warming. Catherine, who's semi-retired now and is a Canadian researcher and professor, she looked back through prehistory, and you would find so few, almost no salmon in the archaeological digs throughout southern and even into northern New England, because salmon were only here for a very brief time. And she pretty much proved it, right? There was something called the Little Ice Age that I think its years were from around 1300 to around 1800. And it was a form of climate change that was happening on the river and in the Atlantic Ocean, but it's well documented in Europe and New England. And there was this cold water, they call it cold water gyre, that came south in the Atlantic to the mouth of the Connecticut. And salmon, being a little bit pioneering, they came to the Connecticut River, and they were here for some centuries, but they were going back. By the time the Little Ice Age was waning, was about the time when the Europeans had already chopped down all the woods around, and the hills were actually barren, all the way up into northern New England along the Connecticut, and they built the dams. But the Connecticut was no longer the cold water river, a cold water salmon river way back then. So it was folly to ever start this program. It set us back for 50 years. And now we're having these secret bargaining between a massive Canadian venture capital firm who is here really for money, registered in Delaware. The river flows backwards into the killer sewer at Northfield Mountain, right in Massachusetts. And we are balancing, Massachusetts really owes New Hampshire and Vermont a living river, and we all owe those that come after us a living ecosystem, because that's what you do when climate change is breathing down your back. So I'm just going to name some people who are at this point responsible for offering coming generations a living river, and then we're going to open it up for questions. And I hope I have been somewhat cogent in making this understandable. But let me just say that these are the people that should be held responsible for whether or not Northfield Mountain gets relicensed as a wide open mouth river killer in a Fish and Wildlife Service. And I would start with Kathleen Theoharides, who's Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs in Massachusetts, because they are all sorts of tied into this wind and big storage at Northfield. And then there's the governor, or Governor Charlie Baker. And then the Watershed Council has got to be tagged with this. If you're gonna call yourselves a watchdog, Andy Fisk, who is the director there, is now the Mass Public Representative on something called the Connecticut River Atlantic Salmon Commission, who has some management authorities on the river. You haven't done your job. And then, of course, there's ISO New England, who loves Northfield Mountain for the one thing that it did. In 2003, there was an East Coast blackout, and for a few minutes, Northfield's very dense energy was used to reattach the power grid between New York State and Ohio, where the lights went out. So ISO New England just has kept this plan around as a cheap insurance policy. And I also have to remind folks that if many of you, I believe, were here in 2010, and I wonder if you remember that we had to live by candlelight without electricity from May 1st to, I think, the 9th of November. Do you remember that at all? Because that was a year that Northfield Mountain choked on the sediments and death that it creates in the river, trying to clear out its upper reservoir, and didn't operate from May 1st to November 9th, I believe is the date. Can we operate a power grid without Northfield Mountain? Well, there you go. I don't remember any of us losing any kind of power. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, ISO New England, they are blind to climate. They basically, what wags their dog is marketing and big corporations like Eversource, National Grid. And now we have PSP, First Light, and the money goes elsewhere. All right, let me get through this more quickly. Wendy Weber, who's the Northeast Regional Director of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service right here in Hadley. She's got to be watching this. I want people to remember these names if future generations aren't going to be offered a living river in Massachusetts. Ms. Donna Whiteling, Director of Protected Resources, National Marine Fisheries Service. I believe she's in Washington. There's Mr. Mark Tiza, who's Director of Mass Fish and Wildlife. These are the people that are supposed to be arguing for our river right now, and we have no access to what they're bargaining. Mr. Caleb Slater, Anadromous Fish Project Leader and for Mass Division. He is responsible for the migratory fish passing upstream and down safely by Northfield Mountain. Turners Falls, and lastly, Mr. Jess Leddick, Chief of Regulatory Review for Mass Division. These are the folks that, if you don't think that it's okay that there's a killer foreign-owned plant going to operate for another 50 years, you need to talk about them, and you need to make some noise, maybe contact your legislatures about. Let me open it up. And thank you, Lisa. I think you're there. And thank you, folks, for joining me. I know it's a lot to swallow. You can maybe get my Karl Meyer writing blog. There's lots of information on there. I give permission for Lisa and the friends to give out my email address if people have further questions. If you want to argue that we can't have, if we can't have clean energy and renewable energy without killing a river ecosystem, it will be a very short conversation. So thanks.
So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask. We've got a little bit of time left. And
I put something in the chat about the names. They went by really fast. Are they in Carl's blog? I have
Yes, they are.
Okay, good. I do have a question. Can I ask?
Sure.
Okay. What is confusing to people who listen to me when I talk about this issue is when I say it flows backward, well, they say there is a section that flows backwards, and that is in the Northfield Mountain area. How much of it really does flow backwards? That's the question. And coupled with that is, well, there is, of course, inflow. The Connecticut River has countless tributaries. So the river does have a current that does go towards the Atlantic. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think I did cover that. When Northfield Mountain is operating, literally 2/3 of the year, when it is pumping these massive mansions, one every second for hours at a time, everything in it going to die. We know that about 1/3 of the year, when the median routed flow from all the in streams coming into the river is around 4,500 cubic feet per second, and Northfield turns on its 15,000 cubic feet per second pumps, that the river literally flows backward for at least 3 miles. And you know, if the rest of the river flows downstream, I don't think that matters very much to the people of Vermont or New Hampshire when Northfield Mountain is going to eat the migratory fish that are supposed to come back in 5 years. So it's literally a river that is erased. It leaves no natural characteristics of a river, and it becomes America's or Massachusetts' shameful sewer. But it impacts an entire ecosystem, and you know, the 50 miles upstream and many miles downstream.
So the 3 miles are not in the mountain. That is where I'm not.
They are in the stretch between Northfield Mountain. If people can envision this, and the road doesn't go, but if you know where the French King Rock is and the French King Bridge. And then you make that hard right turn and you're coming down almost to the part where you're not along the river, but it's where Franklin County Tech and the airport is. I mean, that's a huge, that's an obscene amount of energy to kill a river. Okay. And you're never going to get that energy back. And I guess since I keep thinking of things that I might have put in here, but just to give you an idea of the amount of waste that Northfield Mountain creates, public sector PSP, First Light, had been bragging at some point that they create enough energy to power 1 million homes, 1 million homes for a whole year. Actually, they said 1.3 million. But actually, the truth of the matter is they don't create any energy. They have actually, by that time, they have actually consumed, before they put out a single megawatt, they've actually consumed the energy of 1.97 million homes before sending it out as high price second use energy, right? And so if you looked at that, like if you look at it through some US Census stuff, they've actually squandered a full complement of energy for a year of 429,000 homes, right? While killing a river, pulling it backwards, that is wasted energy, and that is enough energy to supply the housing, all the housing units in Suffolk County, basically Metro Boston, which includes Chelsea, Revere, Winthrop, Boston Center, plus all the 59,000 housing units in Hampshire County, and nearly every, except save a 10,000 or few, nearly all the houses in Franklin County. That would be squandered pulling the Connecticut River backwards daily.
Is that in your blog too, those figures? They are really powerful.
Yeah, those things are out there somewhere, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Powerful
numbers.
It's a powerful corporation. So I'm okay leaving it here. Like I said, I think I want to thank Lisa, and I want to thank the friends of the library and the librarian. Like I said, libraries are democracy incarnate to me. You can walk into any library anywhere. You don't have to have a dime in your pocket. You know, we're getting so close to a two-tiered system that I just want to thank them. Suzanne, I see your hand up.
Yeah, it just occurred to me to ask, are you the only stakeholder that's challenging this really rotten deal? And who else is possibly concerned?
Oh, Suzanne, that's a good question. It's a tough one. I'm the only individual that followed this, and I knew I could do it as a journalist and somebody who has studied the river. So there was somebody that could talk about it from the inside. There is so much money involved. The towns are stakeholders, there's everybody's sort of in line for this or that. So I don't have any inside look to that right now. The stakeholders are us. In general, the stakeholders are the public, right? But this plan is operating in Massachusetts for Canadian cash, registered in Delaware. They're getting away with as much as they possibly can. So every town, the towns of Northfield, Irving, Montague are all stakeholders, and everybody's sort of in line to get the best cash deal for this or that. And my position is always, you don't sell out an ecosystem. This is how we save ourselves in the time of climate. But I can't really speak to any individuals, but right now, as far as the killer aspects of Northfield Mountain, they are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries, and Mass Division of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Environmental Protection.
Thank you.
I want to thank folks again and Lisa. And this was sort of a challenge for me. I'm not a big online person at all. So I'm glad. Thank you for your questions and your patience. And I hope I left you with at least some ideas. Very complicated, but just we're 40 years behind, and we're owed a living river, and so are our future generations. That's my position. I'll be there till the last dog dies. They're not going to be, nobody's going to forget, how this comes out as far as on my watch.
Good.
Well, I want to thank Karl for being here tonight, for being part of our Meet Your Neighbors program. And again, thanks to the Friends of the Greenfield Public Library for providing the Zoom subscription so we can do this. We have recorded this session, and sometime the next couple days it will appear on our YouTube page. We'll put a link on the library's Facebook page to the YouTube video once it's up, and that way you can go back to it and view it again if you've missed something. You can also feel free to ask us, send me questions, and I will forward them to Karl. You can send them to us at librarian@greenfieldpubliclibrary.org. And as Karl said, if you have questions, we will hand out his email address, since he's told us we can do that. So thank you very much, and I hope everybody has a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Karl, too. Okay.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Karl.
Thank you.
Bye, Lynn.